Hello, and welcome to Autism After 18, a podcast presented by Spectrum Connections, an instruction services resource for autistic adults. I'm Tristan Radke.
And I'm Louise Getz.
This podcast is for autistic individuals and their families who are navigating the tricky terrain of adulthood.
As a high school student, you had an individual education plan. You probably had people who helped you do your best in classes and build some of your skills. College is a different story. They don't have to provide the same level of services as high school, but they do have to follow a federal law that protects disabled students from discrimination. Most colleges have disability service offices that help students get the accommodations they need to finish their classes and get their degree.
Our guest today is Alicia Reinke-Tuthill. She is the manager of ability services at University of Wisconsin, River Falls. Alicia has extensive experience working with disabled students, helping them navigate the strange new world of college and post-secondary programs. Alicia, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks so much for welcoming me on. This is a topic that I obviously am very passionate about, so I appreciate the opportunity to chat a little bit more about that.
First, could you just give us some background on the kind of services that your office and others like it provide for college students?
So when it comes to talking about services that our offices provide or other disability services offices, I think you can break it down into two essential areas. So academic accommodations and housing accommodations. Most offices offer both of those things in which they coordinate. Academic accommodations could be anything from additional test time, note-taking, audiobooks. Everything is determined on a case-by-case basis. So there's accommodations we've offered hundreds or thousands of times and accommodations we've offered once or twice. So I really encourage students to recognize that it's not a one size fits all sort of thing. It's very individualized for the student's need. And that's the same with housing too. So that can range from a single room, an emotional support animal, a specific location or placement in a residence hall. So there's a pretty range of services in terms of accommodations that are provided. But there's a lot of variation in terms of what specific campuses provide. So it really depends on the campus you go to get a better understanding of the scope of the services.
Wow. So does a student register with your office as a part of the college application process?
Short answer, no. And one of the reasons why that is too is that connecting with our office or registering for services is an optional thing, right? Students don't necessarily need to connect with us. They're not automatically registered for services. It's a choice that the student has.
So how does a student get registered with your office, Alicia?
So I think there's a lot of variation with that. A lot of campuses across the nation have electronic-based accommodation software systems. So there's just an online application that's on the homepage of our website. But the online form is really easy for students to get started. So they just fill that out. And then once they complete that, they'll get a confirmation to set up an intake appointment. So all students are required to at least have one intake appointment to get started with our process. And that's really just an opportunity for us to hear from the student, find out what they need, and get a better understanding of that process for them as well. We do require documentation as part of this process as well. And so in terms of what we're looking for, that varies considerably depending on the disability of the student. And I always tell students that the process of documentation is by no means meant to be exhaustive. We want the process to be easy. And the documentation is really there to provide more context and information about the student's history and background from someone who knows them really well or has that context. Because generally, I only meet with a student one time before we make those decisions about what accommodations they're going to have throughout the duration of their collegiate career. So it's really more to provide that information and context rather than thinking of it as more of a just basic eligibility. It's helpful information for us to have when we're making those decisions.
Okay. So what kind of documents do they need?
I figured that would be a question that would come up shortly after. So yeah, I kind of mentioned the process varies depending on disability. So for autistic students, I like to generally put it in two reference points. If a student was diagnosed has an autism diagnosis that's relatively recent, so like within the last 5 years, maybe 6 years, we typically would ask that they supply that documentation that has that evaluation, because usually those reports are pretty thorough and have some good context and information. In addition, if the student had an IEP or 504 plan, we would ask for the most recent copy of that IEP plan or 504 plan. So a combination of both of those things is generally helpful. Now, if a student was diagnosed way back when they were like 5 years old or something like that, that initial evaluation probably might not be up to date or is overly helpful because of the age of the document, right? But, if the student is eligible for accommodations at the high school level, generally their reevaluation requirements for services that school districts have to engage in. So if you have a most recent evaluation report that was done by the school district, that also could be helpful information to submit. So it really is, very student specific, but it does give you a general sense of the type of information. The other thing that I would say as well, if a student has more than one diagnosis, so if they're have an autism diagnosis, maybe it's ADHD or anxiety or anything like that, and they're working with like a primary care provider, and they could also speak to that information. We do have something we call our collaborative document form, which providers can provide more context by completing that form as well. So I know that's a lot of different types of responses, but there are different types of documentation that we will accept. And again, working with the student to find a process and information that will work best for them.
Okay. Are you aware of differences between other institutions in River Falls?
I would say the framework is pretty much identical across the board in terms of the type of information and documentation that you receive or that we generally ask for. I will say this just as a general trend or push in higher education. Over the years, the documentation requirements generally become more and more lenient, generally speaking. Just there's a lot of different equity issues that might be involved with access to medical care and, access to some of those services that other folks might not have. So we do obviously require documentation, but we might have scenarios where if a student, for whatever reason, is not able to get the information readily and they need supports more immediately, we can grant provisional accommodations while they're collecting the information and documentation. So there's a lot of flexibility in that, but generally the core is pretty much the same and the framework is the same, but we are moving as a field to having just a little less rigorous requirements for documentation.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Are disability service offices available in all post-secondary schools, both 4-year and 2-year, et cetera?
So the answer is yes, but I think is probably the best response. Yes, but the way that they're structured, what other offices might be included in that can vary. Generally speaking, every campus has an office like what we have at River Falls, right? It's just, it might be called something different. It might be housed in a different area. Other services might be kind of also offered in that area, but every campus needs to have an accessibility coordinator, at least one accessibility coordinator on a campus. They might do multiple tasks, right? But they have to have those services available to students on every college campus.
Wow, that's great to know. So is the registration with your office good for just the school year? Or does the student need to register each year they attend the school?
The registration process is one initial eligibility registration process, right? So if a student connects with us as a first-year student, they only need to go through that initial process one time. Sometimes I only meet with a student one time throughout the duration of their collegiate career when they initially get registered for services. And I always tell students it's a relatively low investment for what you get out of it. It's not that we're asking you to come in all the time. We're not asking you to continuously submit documentation information. It's just kind of that front end where there's a little more steps involved. But we always tell students that this process is whatever you want it to be, right? So if you feel like it's helpful to connect every semester, we can connect every semester. If you feel like, maybe just once a year is appropriate, that's awesome too. Or if it's just the one time. So it's really dependent on the student to kind of just let us know what they feel like they need. But again, yeah, it is just connecting that one time. And that's the same for housing accommodations too. So if a student applies and gets hypothetically like a single room through the accommodation process, that would follow that accommodation would follow that student throughout the duration of the time that they're a resident.
This podcast is brought to you by Spectrum Connections, a nonprofit organization providing skill instruction and mentoring support to young autistic adults.
What kind of accommodations can an autistic student get through your office?
sometimes autistic students might look at accommodations and think, well, I don't need testing accommodations, or I don't need maybe some of these more traditional accommodations that that most students get when they connect with our office. That might make them hesitant to want to connect with us because they feel like they may not need us, or they feel like, well, there's no way they can really support that, so I'm not going to reach out and I'm not going to connect. I think the biggest benefit in connecting with an office like ours is just having that connection to us. That way, if there is an issue or a concern that comes up, it's much easier for us to work with an instructor when we have a connection to the student. We know the situation, we know the background, rather than coming into a situation where we don't have that information.
So it's good to register and make that connection early, even if they're not sure they need it.
And the other thing I would definitely echo in terms of information that's important for first-year students to know is that accommodations are not retroactive, meaning they don't work in reverse and fix something that happened in the past, right? So if the student was never connected with us and they do poorly on an exam, or they're falling behind in their coursework, we can try our best to advocate on their behalf, but it's very difficult to work with faculty and instructors in that working backward mode. So that's one reason why we really encourage students to connect, even if you're looking at just general accommodations and you're like, I'm not sure there's anything I really need. But just having that connection is really important in case that happens. It's kind of like a fail-safe, right? Fail-safe, having someone to go to if that issue does arise.
I think that's an important point. Disability services can't really help a student get a do-over for a bad grade if the student isn't already registered with their office.
One thing I would also say in terms of specific autistic accommodations that I've seen that students have really benefited from, the ability to take breaks in class. So if a student is feeling really overwhelmed with the environment and feeling like they're not able to necessarily focus at that point in time, just taking the time to step out of class to kind of do what you need to do to feel ready, to be prepared to return so you can focus and go through that. I mean, in a college class, you could just get up and leave. Like, no one's stopping you from doing those things. Sometimes it's really helpful for students to feel like, hey, I kind of have permission to do this, right? And my faculty know, and I feel okay about doing that.
Yes, it's good to know you can do that. Take a break when you need to.
But I would also echo what I said in terms of they're very individualized, right? So if a student comes to me with a specific concern, we're going to work through it and see if we can identify what we need to do. And I even tell students, if you don't know it's an accommodation, just ask, right? You're not going to know unless you ask, right? So we want students to feel comfortable doing that, but obviously that means you got to know what the concern is and be able to communicate that. Another one that I think is probably pretty common from a housing perspective is a single room accommodation. We have quite a few students who seek that out, being able to control their environment a lot better, being able to kind of have that safe space to go maybe after a long day of social interaction, having that space to kind of decompress. Is something that a lot of our students seek out and utilize as well. It's just important to recognize that it's not a boilerplate, just check the box sort of thing. And, maybe, just kind of reiterating that there are unique things that can be done. And you don't find out until you have that conversation. And then I typically tell families it's better to find out that you don't need them than you do. Looking back and trying to work through that issue or problem second semester, right? So so it's an overview of the general types of accommodations that autistic students could receive.
Cool.
Yeah. So how do you tell professors about a student's accommodations?
Here's an important thing to note about that. So at the K-12 level, generally, if you're working with a case manager, that case manager will send the IEP or whatever the plan is specifically to each of the students' instructors. But generally, the communication is coming from someone else on your behalf, right? So that is generally how it's done at the K-12 level. Now, if we're looking at colleges, most campuses, I say most because not all, most campuses, the student takes ownership of that initial process, right? So for us, again, we have an electronic accommodation software system. So basically what students do is they just check a couple boxes of the courses they want to use their accommodations in, and the system will automatically send a letter to their instructors notifying them of your accommodations, right? So the letter comes from the student, right? And then goes directly to the instructor. So we're not necessarily sending the information on behalf of the student is. And the student is choosing which accommodations they want to use in each specific course. It varies a little bit, but I would say for the most part, it's the student's responsibility to take ownership of that. Because again, this process is optional, it's their choice, and you have a lot of freedom, which I think is encouraging for students, that they get to pick and choose when they need to use something and when they don't.
What information do the professors receive?
In terms of what they know, I think that's also, there's a difference between how they find out and what they find out, because those are two separate things. So at the high school level, your teachers will know specifically what your diagnosis is and what they need to do, right? They'll have that information, whether it's a 2-year college or a 4-year college. There is no specific diagnosis information listed on the letter that goes out to the instructors, right? It just states that the student has this accommodation and this is what they need to do to accommodate the student. It's really good and in fact completely confidential, and you have a right to choose what you want to disclose, when you want to disclose, if you want to disclose anything. On the flip side of that, no, they don't have the same information and background that I might have, in terms of what you may need or the things you might feel like they should know, right? Is there something that's not listed on this letter that you feel is very important for your professor to know? We always ask that question, and sometimes the answer is no, and sometimes the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, what is that, right? So we work with students to kind of follow up and just say, we might help them craft an email to them, like, hey, just following up. I just wanted to let you know I'm going to be a student in your class. I just wanted to give you a heads up about a few things, right? So that's, generally the process in terms of how they're notified and again, the type of information that they'll know with that process.
Alicia, that's so empowering. That's really neat to hear. So I have a question. What's the difference between an accommodation and a modification?
I'm going to start with modification. So modification as an example would be, so let's say hypothetically a student really struggles with writing, and their modification might be that instead of doing the requirement is a 5-page paper, and with their modification, they're allowed to do 3 pages instead, right? So we're modifying the content to reduce the amount of work that's done. That might be for a math class. Maybe you're doing odds instead of the entire assignment that's outlined. And those are modifications, right? Because it's changing the essential components of what the assignment is actually doing, right? It's actually changing that and making it different. And accommodation does not, right? Accommodations never modify or change any of the expectations of the course component or assignment, right? The student is coming in with a lot of modifications in high school and they're transitioning to college where those things are not allowed, right? Where you're not able to have reduced work, you're not able to be waived from certain courses, right? It's important to kind of take that into consideration when you're thinking about your course load.
Are parents involved in the process of asking for and getting accommodations?
I would say that more than any other office on campus for first-year students, when you're getting connected, we probably interact the most with parents. Parents are welcome to attend an intake appointment. We have plenty of families who do, as long as the student is okay with that. They have to let us know that they're okay with that. But we make it pretty clear that the meeting is for the student. The meeting is not for the family, right? So they can be there and provide support and maybe fill in any gaps of maybe something the student might have missed to mention. But we always direct our questions specifically at the student. They're the ones responding and engaging. When the semester starts, generally the only way we have any communication with parents and families is if the students sign a release of information. So that's the only way in which we generally communicate with students with families, if the student signs off on a release allowing us to do so. Not many of our students do, honestly. And so what we try to encourage students to do when you do go off to college, that you do have that open line of communication with your parents. So you're the ones informing them of the concern rather than hearing it from someone else. And the release is usually not needed as long as, students are keeping their families in the loop.
Yeah. It makes sense that with more autistic students going to college, that this may have changed how disability services offices think about how they support students. Could you describe that?
Before I came here, I worked specifically with autistic college students. That's my background before I came to this position. My own personal experiences working with that specific population definitely shaped how I did this role. Coming in, it was definitely kind of more checkboxy, like, here are the accommodations, here are the things we typically provide. There wasn't really much scope beyond that. We've definitely really reshifted our model in terms of really honing in on the individual case-by-case specific scenarios, because oftentimes it's not in the box. It might not be just a simple accommodation that other students might need. We might need to be thinking in terms of being open-minded, being creative, willing to work with instructors to provide creative solutions, because oftentimes when we do that, when we work through those creative things, we do need to have quite a bit of interaction with the instructor just to make sure that we're doing it the right way. We're, again, not altering anything essential to the course, because that's, again, a framework of accommodations we need to be mindful of when we're working with instructors. But I think there is a lot to learn from, working with autistic students and broadening that access to our other disabled students who would benefit from similar types of accommodations.
Alicia, thank you for your insights. Many autistic students need support to finish their degree program. It's been great learning more about how you can help them reach their goals.
Yes.
So much for having me. Oh, I interrupted.
No, it's okay.
Thanks for having me. There you go. Hopefully that was good.
This podcast is brought to you by Spectrum Connections, providing skill instruction and mentoring services to autistic adults. You can learn about our services by checking our website at spectrum-connections.org.